Well, ladies and gentlemen, hello again, and welcome to another Reflected Reality Simulations video. My name's Graham, this is X-Plane 11 and the Britten-Norman Islander by TorqueSim. This is part 2 of the video series, and today we're going to fly an ILS approach to runway 20 at Southampton on the south coast of the UK. We're going to look at how the X-Plane default 530 GPS unit interacts with the KFC225 Autopilot that TorqueSim have provided. There are some little quirks in there that are quite true to life. The behaviour of the Autopilot is very realistic for the most part. There are some things it does that aren't exactly true to life, but rest assured that general aviation autopilots do have lots of oddities to them. They're not the integrated flight management systems that you see on airliners. So having to work around one or two little quirks is entirely normal with general aviation autopilots. The KFC225 is 25-30 years old, and the 530 is about 20 years old. So that's Chichester Harbour. In the background we've got Hayling Island. We're routing along the coast towards Portsmouth, and then we'll turn up towards Southampton. Let's have a look inside. So the first thing to be aware of is the heading pointer. When you're using the autopilot in this aircraft, always keep the heading pointer where you'd want the aircraft to go should there be an autopilot mode downgrade or a failure. The reason behind that is due to how the GPS and the autopilot interact. I want you to consider this CDI button. Although it's part of the GNS530 here, consider the CDI button and the related GPS VLOC mode annunciator to be a completely separate switch. This CDI button sends a signal to the autopilot, and it tells the autopilot whether or not to use the GPS information directly, or whether or not to use the information from the HSI to feed into the nav mode. Watch this nav annunciation. When I change to VLOC, it fails into roll mode, and that's entirely correct. Bendix didn't want the autopilot to experience a nav source change and go straight into navigating on a source it wasn't expecting. So whenever it changes modes, whenever it changes from digital GPS steering to analog HSI steering, it will fail into roll mode. Now there is a quirk on the X-Plane version, and that is whenever the navigation radio has a valid nav signal, it will fail into heading mode rather than roll mode. The real one doesn't do that, but it's not a problem as long as the heading bug is always aligned. Remember, the autopilot, as I said, predates the GPS by quite a few years. The GNS530, when it's used with a KFC225, it has to have automatic switching between GPS and VLOC disabled. As it's flying the approach, when it sequences the final approach waypoint, the 530 is capable of switching automatically to VLOC. But on the installation with the 225, that must be switched off. It must not be allowed to do that. And that's not an option we have in X-Plane, so we need to pay particular attention to when the GPS mode swaps. Rather than going all the way to Mivla, let's simply go to Proc, activate approach, and it will nav to Southampton. It's suggesting we put a course in of 334. So I'll wind the pointer around to 334. And as I said, we'll align the heading bug where we want the aircraft to go as well. So if you've been watching my channel for a long time, hopefully you'll know how to fly an ILS approach by now. We're down at the southeast here. We're going to fly towards Southampton, and we're going to go out from the VOR on the 031 radial. 113.35 is for the Southampton VOR. That's on the number 2 radio over here, and I can monitor it on the CDI. And the ILS is 110.75, which we've got ready on the number 1 radio. We should have a DME to fly this approach. It's an ILS DME approach. We're not DME fitted. I would have preferred a separate DME and a standalone Navcom radio rather than the second 430, because this 430 can't be used in GPS mode. It can only work in VLOC. The GPS information can't be presented on the CDI. But we are where we are. The approach gives us the option to use air traffic ranges, radar ranges, rather than the DME. There's one important consideration here as well. I'm going to momentarily switch from GPS to VLOC again, and keep an eye on the HSI. It slews round when I change to VLOC mode, and that shouldn't happen. There's no way for the GPS to do that. However, now that it's done it, I'm going to set my heading pointer for the ILS to 200 degrees. I'll go back to GPS and I'll resync it to where we were. So I've got a VLOC and a GPS. Obviously we're back in roll mode, so I'll put it back into nav now. Again, that's a minor annoyance about the X-Plane default avionics. So you can see Southampton Airport ahead of us. This is the M27 routing down towards the west. Got the River Hamble and the River Itchen. This is Southampton water. The Islander is excellent for practicing IFR flying. It's not too fast and it's a very stable platform. The Autopilot is just clever enough to let you do the kind of flying that I enjoy. It doesn't do everything for you. You've actually got to fly the aircraft through the Autopilot. So 5 or 6 miles before the overhead, I'm going to use that as the point to switch the fuel pumps on. I'm going to verify that we've got the landing lights and the passenger signs on. Landing at sea level airfield as well, I'm going to ease the mixture forward. What I want to do is to minimise the rate of change of the cylinder head temperature. So I'm going to try and avoid making dramatic power reductions. At the moment I'm about 22-23 inches. I'm going to come back to approximately 20 inches and hopefully that gives me around 120 knots. The vertical profile has me going overhead at 3,000 feet, descending down to 1,800 feet. Flight plan says I've got from here about 15 miles, so it'll be about 12 miles to lose 1,200 feet. I'm only going to use 500 feet a minute in the Islander. It's not pressurised and a rapid descent is not very comfortable for the passengers. So if I can, 500 feet a minute. If I'm doing 100 knots, 500 feet a minute is equivalent to a 3-degree glide slope, roughly 3 miles per 1,000 feet. If I'm doing 150 knots, it's about 5 miles per 1,000 feet. Remember, half the ground speed and 1/3 of the ground speed. So it'll be about 4–4.5 miles per 1,000 feet. I don't need to descend straight away when we turn overhead the Southampton VOR. We can fly along level for a little bit longer. If you are flying this as an IR test, you need to consider the entry angle. There's a certain distance or certain angle that you're allowed to go straight outbound. Beyond that angle, if I was coming in, for example, from the northeast, I would have to fly a hold entry to realign. But at this point, I should be okay to go beacon outbound. And in real world flying, outside of the test environment, you'd probably do that anyway. You'd arrange your flight so that you could do that. Incidentally, flying a procedural approach, although the Islander is very much a visual aircraft, the nature of the airfields it operates to means that if you actually have to fly an instrument approach, there's a fairly high chance there may not be air traffic control radar to help you out. So it's always useful to be able to fly the approach procedurally. Here we are, turning overhead the SAM. It's saying set 031, so I'll put 031 on the HSI bar, and as I said, let's move that heading bug round to 031 just for a moment. So remember I said that when the GPS automatically swaps over to VLOC, it's going to fail into either roll or heading mode. Well, because it's receiving an ILS signal now, we can see that up here, it's going to fail into heading mode. So what I want to do to work around that is to preset my heading bug to something sensible. The runway heading is 200 degrees. I'm going to set 230 degrees so that the aircraft flies a reasonable 30-degree intercept. You can see that the radial 031 is tracking nicely here on the number 2 radio, and we've got around about 9 miles to go. So what I'm going to do is go down to 1800 feet in vertical speed, so VS minus 500 arm, check we've got VS arm, and I'm going to make about a 5-inch reduction on the power to hopefully maintain 120 knots. So by minimising the rate of change on the cylinder head temperature, we can extend the life of the engine. I'm not a fan of failure modules that have trigger points where the failure occurs. There's not much you can do with a general aviation engine that will destroy it straight away, other than lack of oil pressure. What you actually do is shorten the lifespan of the aircraft. That may mean that rather than making 2,000 hours between overhauls, it only makes 1,800 or 1,600 hours between overhauls. But there's not much you can do that would cause the thing to fall apart there and then. Failure modules such as the Hot Start TBM 900 are fantastic because they replicate, or they show you how the damage happens over the lifetime of the aircraft, over a long-term period. But I'm not a fan of failure modules that will just cause the aircraft to fail for a simple parameter exceedance. So just a few miles to go to the turn. I'm going to bring up the GPS so we can keep an eye on what it's doing. We're still in GPS mode. We've got 500 feet to go in the descent. And what you're going to see is the aircraft's going to turn inbound. It's going to navigate towards the Charlie India 20. Once it sequences from the Charlie India to the Fox India, you'll see it go from GPS to VLOC, and it'll do that automatically. Now remember, on the real aircraft that automatic switch would be locked out, it wouldn't be allowed on this aircraft, so we need to keep an eye on it. When it changes to VLOC, keep an eye on the annunciator here, it will go from nav to heading, and that's why my heading pointer is pre-armed. 200 feet to go, check that we've got arm, and we've got the fuel pumps on, and that everything is set correctly. There's going to be a further power reduction coming up, so I'm going to set the carb heat now to hot, and pay particular attention to the fact the carb heat is down beside the brake lever here. So it's in the turn, it's captured 1800 feet. I'm not going to increase the power, instead I'm going to let the aircraft slow down to about 100 knots, and we'll fly the ILS at 100 knots. You'll see the information here change from terminal to LNAV. Don't worry about that at all, that's simply telling you the scale, the deviation scale here has changed. This is the point that I would normally be resetting the course pointer, but I know that X-Plane's going to do that automatically. It's slightly unrealistic, but we can live with it. So navigating to the Charlie India, it's sequenced from the Charlie India to the Foxtrot India. It says LNAV here, still GPS. Up here's GPS. Now it's gone to VLOC, and that causes it to go to heading, but because I had my heading bug pre-armed, it's not a problem at all. I'm simply going to push approach, I get glide slope and heading. So the heading is flying it onto the intercept just like the GPS would have done. So when the bar comes in, you'll see heading change to approach. There we go. And because it's changed to approach, I'm going to move the heading pointer around. 95 knots, that's okay. Remember, always keep that heading pointer up to date. Keep it pointing exactly where you want the aircraft to go if the GPS or the autopilot were to fail. Inbound, on the localizer, I'm going to change the number 2 radio over to look at the ILS as well. because you've got the localizer and the glide slope. Sometimes this presentation is a little bit easier. If you're flying in visual conditions, this is an easier reference, but it's nice to have both displayed. We can see the glide slope coming down, and we'll keep an eye on the annunciators here. It should change to glide slope capture. When it captures the glide slope, I'm going to make another 5-inch reduction and try and hold 100 knots. There's glide slope capture, power's coming off. Now we're descending on the glide slope. I'll set 3000 for the normal missed approach, and I'll double check that my heading bug is at the top, make sure the aircraft can follow the heading bug. And that is pretty much all we have to do to get the Islander onto the ILS. No flaps to worry about at the moment, flying quite happily at 100 knots. You could fly this a lot faster, but remember, one of the goals is to minimise the rate of change of the cylinder head temperature. That's what causes thermal stress on the engine. On a long runway, Southampton's short for a commercial runway, it's about 1600 metres, but for an Islander that's about 3 times longer than it needs to be. We could happily land without flaps at Southampton. I'm not going to land though, I'm going to fly the missed approach. So to demonstrate the missed approach to its best advantage, I'm going to configure the aircraft to the full flap landing, and we'll go around from around about 50 feet or so. The minimum's 250 feet, but we want to see the worst case scenario. So at 1000 feet, I'll make a slight power reduction, allow the aircraft to start slowing down. The flap limiting speed is 114 knots, so 105 is fine. We'll take flaps to take off. Then I'll reset the power back roughly where it was, 12 to 13 inches. I'm looking for 75 to 80 knots. Notice that the RPM has dropped off to 2000. That's because the propeller is already fully fine, so I can now push the power lever forward without any change, but the propellers are now ready for the missed approach. I'm going to take the autopilot out at 500 feet, so now is a good point to make sure that the carb heat is cold and the parking brake's off, so I've got 3 levers up and 4 levers forward, all is well. So there's 75, 80 knots at 500 feet, autopilot's coming out. And as I said, we could land the Islander with the flaps in the takeoff position as well, that's allowed. But to demonstrate the go around, I'll take flaps to the landing position and I'll try and follow the glide slope. It's going to need a fair amount of power to do so. A flap full approach in the Islander is not intended for a 3-degree glide slope, it's intended for a much steeper, much shorter approach. In general, a piston engine aircraft, a small piston engine aircraft, doesn't need to be on a 3-degree glide slope because the engines respond fairly promptly to power. It's not like a jet where it takes a while to spool up. So there's minimums at 250 feet. Flying the missed approach on the Islander is exactly the same as the takeoff, except we need to get the flaps to the takeoff position. 70 knots. So that's about close enough. We'll go around, power comes full forward, we pitch to the climb out attitude, put the instrument panel on the horizon, flaps to takeoff. Make sure that we don't go below 65 knots, check the flaps are at takeoff and check the carb heat's cold, and then pitch to maintain 65 to 70. The missed approach at Southampton is straight ahead, above 200 feet, just like the takeoff. Take flaps up, increase the pitch attitude ever so slightly and hold 75 to 80 knots now. About 15 degrees usually does it. Above 500 feet with no obstacles, I'll lower the nose to around about 10 degrees. Again, that's roughly instrument panel on the horizon. I'll bring the RPM back to 2500 and I'll trim the aircraft. We should get about 95 knots climb. And that is just how simple the missed approach is on the Islander. You just put the power forward, set the pitch attitude for the climb, and make sure you get to takeoff flaps. It will not climb really with landing flap. And if it's not performing, you may have the carb heat halt. So there's 1000 feet. As before, I'm going to lower the pitch attitude to around about 500 feet per minute, adjust the trim. I'll put my autopilot in using my keystroke there. That's VS plus 500, VS arm. And because I'm doing a kind of visual procedure now, I'm going to go to 1500 feet rather than climb all the way up to 3000. I'll put the aircraft into heading mode, and above 1000 feet I can select the fuel pumps off and check the fuel pressure. And that's the missed approach in the TorqueSim Islander. Very straightforward. As I said, the oddities around the autopilot handling, whilst not exactly precisely prototypical, not exactly what the real thing does, are very representative of the kind of issues you have with older general aviation avionics, where not everything is fully integrated and there's always some odd set of rules or instructions you've got to follow to make it do something. So don't let that put you off the realism of the aircraft. The fact that you've got a quirk to work around because it's X-plane is no different from having a quirk to work around because you've got a certain firmware on a certain year of autopilot on a certain airframe. I hope all that makes sense. If you do have any questions about the video flying the Islander, please feel free to leave them in the comment section below. The next video will be having a look at the visual approach and landing back into Lyon Solent. I hope you'll join me for that. Thanks very much for listening to me, and I hope to speak to you again shortly.